Good morning, and thank you for joining us. We're going to give people a few more minutes to log on for this important webinar, and then we'll get started. All right, as you will have been informed before this, as you logged in, this meeting is being recorded. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really looking forward to this conversation because we think it's so important to identify ways to implement SDG Target 17.19, the very last target in the group of SDG targets, which calls for countries to develop measures of progress on sustainable development that complement gross domestic product. It's really important, especially in the lead up to the Summit of the Future, which is an opportunity to really focus attention on this issue. So as part of that process, the UN Secretary General has identified complementary measures of GDP as a key step for accelerating the achievement of the SDGs and leaving no one behind. But what is this complementary measure of GDP, and how can we implement it? So this side event is going to explore lessons learned from recent studies measuring comprehensive wealth in Ethiopia, Indonesia, and Trinidad and Tobago over a 25-year period. And so following a presentation of this research showing that these indices can be constructed using existing data, presenters are going to reflect on developing indices with existing national data sources and share recommendations for using these complementary indices to better guide decision-making and deliver on the 2030 agenda. So I'm very pleased to present my colleague, Livia Bizikova, who is a lead with IISD. She's leading our work on assessment and monitoring, and she's been leading our Comprehensive Wealth Project for many years, and is going to present these really interesting studies that her team did with, and the reports that were written by academics in Indonesia, Trinidad and Tobago, and Ethiopia, constructing these alternative indices. So with that, over to you, Livia.
Thank you so much, Lynn, and thank you for ability to talk about this work. And as Lynn said, this work really looks at IISD's work on moving beyond GDP. And I'm going to share some of the results specifically related to what it would mean to accelerate SDGs. And now I would need to share my screen, which I am. So can I get the slides, Matt? Sorry. Okay. So here we are. Okay. So, and I'll just put them to the share mode. Okay, so on these slides, I would like to focus on how kind of moving beyond GDP could change the way of achieving SDGs and what could be those benefits. Because one thing is that we often talk about, or at least I think we all at ISD had the feeling that having a different measure of progress, not only GDP, that has such a prominent presence in terms of media, politicians, but also public, may take the decision-making, the prioritization of investments into a more sustainable pathway. So as my colleague Lynn said, the study was done in Ethiopia, Trinidad and Tobago, and Indonesia with the 3 universities, with the small IISD team of Rob Smith and Zakaria Zundi, that we work together on these reports, and many other external colleagues. So now let's, so there has been a lot of talk, and Lynn just talked about that, about what's wrong with GDP. And it has been for many, many decades out there, mostly in the academic literature, about GDP failing to address environmental degradation, failing to address investments that require kind of a long-term thinking, because primary GDP is a short-term indicator and favors activities that deliver results fast. And for example, investing into an educational system change, improvement that usually takes many, many years until those students with better education come out and have better skills. So, but last year, the UN Secretary General published a policy brief that talked very specifically about the need to move beyond GDP, because it actually stated that GDP doesn't capture current complexities of our world, and therefore, by using the GDP as a measure of progress, we may fail to address urgent challenges of these days. It also said that it's for many countries, by relying on prioritizing investment and policies to grow GDP, have a serious consequences for their sustainability. And similarly, on the bottom of this slide, there was a recent report by UN Human Rights Council from this July 2024, and it basically said that by focusing on GDP growth, and they called it a dangerous fixation with GDP, we may limit our abilities to address extreme poverty and also extreme hunger. So again, so there is now a very clear call to move beyond GDP, but so what should we do then? So the UN Secretary General brief also says that we need to shift to new metrics that is somehow has very similar features of GDP, meaning it's a coin size, it's robust, it's being monitored by countries, it's monitored regularly so that we can address decision-making as we get the information, and also that it's actually usable for decision-making. So there are different ways to go beyond GDP, and I just highlight those that were listed in the UN Secretary General's brief. And we are now looking in the next phase of the project exactly into these. So there are the indicator sets or dashboards that basically is a set of indicators that monitor well-being in the country. These many countries used to have way before SDGs when we talked about measuring sustainable development. And these used to be indicator sets that compiled social issues, environmental issues, inequality, often cultural issues. So these were these kind of dashboards to measure well-being in the country. Now, often these are also aligned with indicators that are used to monitor SDGs. The second set of indicators that are being suggested are indicators that are well-defined, monitored for many years, accepted, especially in the international level. Countries refer to it, but and sometimes they also get integrated in the policy-making process. So this is, for example, the Human Development Index that is widely globally known, and also, for example, the Multidimensional Poverty Index, which try to look at the different aspects of poverty instead of just the money and the income terms. So these are indicators, again, that meet those criteria. Well-known, well-developed methodology, already monitored globally. But again, they capture some of the GDP challenges, but they may other challenges that may not be captured. The third group of indices, and this is which we worked with, so this is why it's highlighted in yellow, are called wealth indices or expanded wealth measures. So these are indices that measure the wealth of the country. And there are two well kind of defined reported indices done by two international agencies. So there's comprehensive wealth done by the World Bank, and there's inclusive wealth done by UNEP that they published yearly, bi-yearly, or kind of in a certain frequency for every country in the world is estimated by these international agencies. So we basically took the methodological definition with some adjustments and applied it to the three countries to see first, can a country, any of these three countries have enough data to be able to do these estimates? And second, what these policy implication of these estimates would be from a sustainability point of view. Now, in this presentation, I'll really focus on what this means from an SDG implementation. So I'm not really going into the specific national policy implication, but how this could accelerate, as an example of an applied beyond GDP index, could accelerate efforts to implement the SDGs. The last part, which also the brief says of the UN Secretary General, is that we need to account for gender aspects, inequality, regional differences, and other differences within countries and regions. In our work, we haven't really done this part because we really focused in the national level, but this is definitely something that as part of the efforts to move beyond GDP, we would need to also account for these differences. So now why the wealth index? So in our case, basically, we focused on measuring using the methodology by the World Bank to measure comprehensive wealth. So this is basically the title of the index. And here, the wealth in both studies, inclusive and comprehensive, defined by 5 assets. So every country to be wealthy should have some produce capital, which are the infrastructure building factories. It should have some natural capital, which is the nature, both market and non-market natural capital. So also agricultural land, forestry, fisheries, mining resources, but also the non-market resources, biodiversity, ecosystems, other, wetlands and other things that cannot have a specific market value, climate. Then there is the human capital, which is basically the people of the country and their ability to deliver income, to deliver services, and therefore using their skills and knowledge to be able to create income for themselves and for the country. Then there is financial capital, which are the stocks and bonds, and then the social capital, which is basically the cooperative relationships that are in the society and how people work together, cooperate, trust each other, trust the government, and those things. So in this study, we focused really on all 5 capitals, but the produce capital, human capital, financial capital, and the market natural capital were also expressed in monetary terms and estimated they change over time, while the social capital were staying in the level of indicators and hasn't been aggregated. So now, when we looked at the estimate, all the estimates for the 3 countries, also compared to GDP, are available in the ISD website, and we will share with you the links. So, but what we learned from these estimates for the 3 countries to measure the wealth as an underlying asset of the country, instead of only focusing on the GDP, which is more the income that is created from this wealth. And if the country doesn't build this wealth, over time, similarly to a household, may not be able to generate income because of the kind of depleting their own resources. So, but now let's look what we learned from these estimates from an SDG point of view. So first of all, there is the produce capital. So when we look at produce capital, we can say that it directly refers to a number of SDGs. It refers to SDG 9, which is related to innovation and industry. It relates to energy and allocations into promoting clean energy and also climate targets, but the others as well. We found that while the SDGs really, the core focus is promoting resilience, small and medium enterprises, industrialization, employment, in our case, we can say that in all 3 countries, on the positive side, countries do invest into produce capital and to infrastructure. And over the 25 years of the study period, in all the 3 countries, the produce capital has been growing. On the same time, what we found in the 3 countries is that most of the resources, or let's say half, is focusing on supporting fossil fuel related industries and services needed to support fossil fuel industries. And there is, on the other hand, underinvestments in many other sectors. So let's say in Trinidad and Tobago, which is a country with a fossil fuel industry and a reserve, half of their produce capital was really around this reserve. And while the country has the fossil fuel reserve, the investment can be monetized, but after that, basically these produce capital are not really useful for other purposes or for any other use, while the investment already has been allocated. So this is something that we can only see when we started looking about taking this wealth approach. The other thing what we've seen in Ethiopia, which is that there is a lot of produce capital concentrating on manufacturing, which is good. It also prioritizes one of the in the SDG 9, but on the same time, in a case of Ethiopia, there's also a misallocation between the most important resource in the country, which is agriculture, which has the highest contribution to GDP, but the country invests only 4% of the produce capital resources into supporting agriculture through value chains, market access, infrastructure like road storage and things like that. So while in this country there is this kind of a right move to support manufacturing and move towards these goals, there is a misalignment between the current priorities and the ability to kind of exploit the benefits from the manufacturing sector investments. Now let's look at the next one. So probably human capital is the one that is most known to be challenged by you relying on GDP, because changing educational system, implementing new improved access to education takes time until those new skilled people come out from the school system. So from a GDP point of view, it's really not a short-term activity. In the same time, we have to say that in all the countries, including our 3 countries, human capital is the biggest asset of the countries, meaning all countries rely, no matter what development stage they are, they rely on the assets that their own people bring in through their engagement in the labor market. And also informal sector. We haven't really looked at the informal sector, but there is also an important role for human capital. So while the human capital is growing in these 3 countries, it's still significantly less growth or significantly less level in all 3 countries than in other developing countries. So there is a lot of potential for these countries to grow. And that relates to a number of SDGs, absolutely to SDG 4 on education, but also access to SDG 8 on decent work, SDG 9 on industry, and of course, gender equality on SDG 5. So from a policy point of view, when you start taking the wealth approach, you can see that it's important to think of issues around expanding human capital in terms of investing into workers, health, education, and also investing into learnings that would improve productivity. And also being cognizant how we kind of, on the one hand, want to narrow down in certain sector and improve education skill development in certain sector, but also moving away of highly concentrated sectors that could also relate to fossil fuel industries in many cases. The next one is natural capital. And here I didn't put any SDG sides because natural capital relates to all SDGs as kind of the underlying basis of wealth of any country. And we saw in all 3 countries that over the 25 years of period of our study, both market and non-market natural capitals were either stagnating or declining, which means that in order to protect natural capital, we definitely need another measure to complement GDP so that this kind of stagnation or decline can be addressed. So here we're talking about either improving natural capital by investing into natural capital, for example, addressing land degradation, improving soil quality, improving fisheries, forestry management, but also looking at improving natural resource management and extracting, and also improving non-market natural capital, which is basically conservation of resources. In some cases, here is also the issue, which I just will show you in the next slide, is about kind of reinvesting. So if we have resources, let's say, and we've seen it in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, generated from fossil fuel industries, how they can be reinvested into, for example, improving natural capital or human capital to address, either to boost human capital or address the declining natural capital in the countries. So the last thing what I would like to show you is related to the other kind of the opportunity by moving beyond GDP. It also offers a much more integrated approach to think about how to invest to SDGs and achieve multiple targets and multiple goals. So this is the example of Ethiopia with agriculture, where I already mentioned that while agriculture is a very important sector, when the country invests into agriculture, into produce capital over 25 years, there is still quite limited investment compared to other types of investment into agriculture to help addressing yield issues, addressing market access issues. On the same time, when we're looking at the natural capital, again, there is another opportunity to address issues around yield, agricultural productivity to, again, improve the sector, but there's also an opportunity for skill development, addressing training and skill, both in terms of practices, but also health and nutrition that kind of become part of that agriculture investment that touches in all the wealth elements in our wealth portfolio of the country. So now just the last slide. So what we found? So we found that basically by moving beyond GDP, we can have some of the priorities expressed in SDGs, so MEAs, linked to the higher level of kind of a national government investment priorities. And if we fail to do so and only think of specific measures to address SDGs or MAAs, we may be not able to achieve some of these goals. Also, by complementing GDP, we also could be able to much more effectively think about an integrated planning that brings together multiple SDGs. And finally, as Lynn started this event, we found that that in every 3 countries, we found enough national data to compare the comprehensive wealth index to measure the wealth in those capital areas, in those assets, with some data gaps and capacity needs. But it's also kind of, from my point of view, it's a positive message, because we can definitely see that with political commitment, focusing on technical scientific progress and addressing, data disaggregation issue and capacity building issues, we may be able to, as a global community, to move beyond GDP and starting to address these gaps that we are seeing now by just relying on GDP. Thank you so much.
And thank you for that presentation, Livia, and that research that you, Zach, Rob Smith, and the researchers from Ethiopia, Indonesia, and Trinidad and Tobago were involved with. And I know there were a number of other collaborators. So now we're going to move on to a panel discussion, and I'm going to introduce all of the panelists first. And then we'll have 2 rounds. I'll present some questions that each of them will answer in the first and the second round. If we have time, we're going to go to some questions from the group. I see that the chat is very lively. Thank you so much for all the information you're sharing and the questions you're raising there. Please continue to do so as we talk and go further into this interesting topic. So our panelists today, we have Anu Peltola, Director of Statistics at UNCTAD. Anu is currently the Director of Statistics at UNCTAD, and she's also held roles at the UN Economic Commission for Europe and Statistics Finland. And she was most recently involved in the collaboration between UNCTAD, Rethinking Economics, and the Beyond Lab of the UN Office of Geneva to organize an essay contest for young people on what counts for the future. 630 youth from 50 countries submitted essays for this competition. There's a thirst and a hunger for this, addressing this topic. And we're really pleased to have Juliana Makonise from Zimbabwe, who is one of the 10 winners for that essay contest. And so she'll be sharing her thoughts on what counts for the future. Juliana is a BA student at Smith College, where she's studying quantitative economics with a global finance concentration. Also joining us is Heinrich Bullman, Research Director for the Partnership for Economic Policy, PEP. He is the Director of the Macro-Micro Modeling Group at PEP, and he served on the Economic Council of the Economic Society of South Africa since 2019. And he's also an associate professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Pretoria, where he specializes in the development and application of dynamic computable general equilibrium models for practical policy research. And then also we have Florencia Caro Sacchetti, who is an associate researcher at CIPPEC. I'll ask you to introduce that. She's a member of Southern Voice, the Southern Voice Network, and a PhD candidate at Carlos III University of Madrid. She holds an Master of Science in Development Studies and a degree in economics. And as a researcher and practitioner, she works to promote better policies on gender equality, the care economy, migration, and labor inclusion. And also she was selected as a policy leader fellow at the European University Institute and the Young Global Changer, a Young Global Changer by the Global Solutions Initiative. And so for the first round, I will ask each of you to give us about 3-minute intervention on why is it critical to move beyond GDP to advance the SDGs, and also what are specific examples of policies, measures, and investments that countries may put forward if different metrics of measuring progress are used. So first up, Anu, please offer your comments.
Thank you very much, dear participants and organizers. It's my pleasure to join you today for this very varied and nicely constructed panel of discussions. I'll bring some insights from the UN-wide initiative on valuing what counts, launched by the UN Secretary General to address the multiple concerns and challenges we're facing, and to enhance progress towards the SDGs, and especially Target 1719, which was mentioned. The UN system effort was co-led by the UN Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, jointly with the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs and the UN Development Programme. And really, it was inspired by the youth engagement that really surprised us with the substance of contribution. So why it's critical to move beyond GDP? This shift is not just timely, it is essential for securing an inclusive, just, and sustainable future. GDP, while a powerful, widely used and country-owned metric, falls short in capturing human progress and well-being, and many environmental aspects. Historically, GDP emerged to measure economic activity after the Great Depression, and since became a proxy of success. However, it does not account for critical elements, for instance, environmental degradation, social inequality, or unpaid work, leaving women's full contribution to society often hidden. We are at crossroads, facing compounding challenges: climate change, environmental crisis, the pandemic still lingering, economic challenges. We saw a profound disconnect between economic growth and well-being when the Human Development Index declined for 2 consecutive years after 3 decades of progress. This year, the report draws attention to the need to break the gridlock resulting from uneven development progress, high inequality, and polarization globally. GDP can grow due to resource overuse, disaster recovery, or illegal activities rather than societal value addition. The metric alone does not help us align with the SDGs' vision of progress that benefits all people and respects planetary boundaries. We need similarly strong metrics to value well-being, equality, and sustainability. So what are the specific examples of policies and measures? To help us in this transition, the UN system suggested an initial framework to value what counts that could serve as a starting point for identifying specific policies around 6 main elements. The framework is grounded in human rights. It prioritizes well-being for all, fosters solidarity to tackle inequalities, and promotes respect for life and the planet, recognizing actually the intrinsic value of the environment beyond its role in production. It also emphasizes resilience building, participatory governance, and fostering innovative and ethical economies to address today's challenges. So we need to learn from one another. Among many examples, New Zealand and Scotland have developed pioneering well-being economy budgeting to elevate human health, education, and social protection, really to be considered alongside economic considerations when making any decisions. One other example before I finish is that significant strides have been made in environmental economic accounting to measure environmental stocks and flows, material, energy, and carbon intensities, as well as water, forest, land, and waste management. With these metrics, we can really consider trade-offs, evaluate policy impacts on carbon emissions or air quality, and by valuing ecosystem services, we can demonstrate their social and economic benefits and advocate for environmental investment and protection. For too long, we have been making decisions based on economic considerations only and have pushed our planet beyond its limits. I stop here and look forward to the next panelist. Thank you.
Thank you. And over to you, Juliana.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. As previously mentioned, this GDP issue is a timely matter. It's a topic that we've been talking about for a very long time. However, something critical that we need to acknowledge is that we have moved beyond the time where it was a priority during the Great Depression and World War II. And it's now time for us to set our priorities straight and consider what's important present moment. So previously, when I attended the event where we were looking at what counts in the future, most of the young people there, they did acknowledge that it's time that we think beyond the aggregate production, aggregate income, and aggregate expenditure values that are being used right now and prioritize the people, because people are at the center of GDP. I penned a concept that I call the GDPE mindset, where we acknowledge that growth depends on people and the environment, because without the people, an economy would not exist. The people contribute towards production. The people are the one who contribute towards each and everything that happens in the procedure. So that is why we need to acknowledge their financial health, their mental health, their social health, each and everything that they bring to the table, because it is crucial and it is vital in every single process. So that is why we propose this particular aspect. And the second thing is also thinking about green GDP. I know we already mentioned the aspect of the environment. We're talking about climate action a lot, SDG 13, but how do we get there? We need to really look at our behavior as individuals and think about how our productive measures are contributing towards the degradation of the environment. Hence why we're here, why we're talking about this, because we need to move beyond that. So one of the key things that we need to think about is a hybrid system. So initially, right now, GDP is just a number. It's literally just a numeric that we use. But how about we think of a hybrid system that uses a scale-based metric? When we're talking about the Human Development Index, that's also an example of something that has been used. But let's complement that with other avenues. Think of how we can measure well-being, how we can measure equality, how we can measure climate impact. Those are the critical things that are contributing towards the society that we're in right now. So it's time that we move beyond the times, that we move forward and think about the future, where we're going, what we're prioritizing. And at the end of the day, the people and the environment, they really do matter. Hence why we're having this conversation today. So I'll leave this time to the next panelist.
Thank you so much. Henrik, over to you.
Right, thank you, everyone. Yeah, so I thought this might happen, that by the time I get to talk, so many good and clever things has already been said that I might seem to repeat a lot of it, but yeah, so it goes. So on the question of why it is critical to move beyond GDP in the context of the SDGs, look, I doubt there are too many skeptics in this audience, and the need to move beyond GDP to advance the SDGs was actually well articulated in the initial development and forming of SDG Target 17.19 initially. But to perhaps say it again and say it differently, it is because achieving and measuring sustainable development is about far more than just domestic production levels, right? I think we've heard it already, we'll hear it again. Now, make no mistake, GDP remains the single most important indicator for economists to do various types of macroeconomic analysis and make our predictions. And it's part of the reason why it continues to stick around. But it is also well understood by now that telling a complete story involves much more than just GDP. As already said today, GDP is, amongst others, unable to account for measuring human or social or natural capital. It's silent on inequality. It has many short-run versus long-run blind spots. However, that being said, we shouldn't be lazy. GDP or even GDP per capita as indicators were never intended to give such insights. And these are well-known issues by now, as already said. And it turns out that solutions are often readily available if we consult the literature, right, and do a bit of extra work. As Juliana also already mentioned, the World Bank developed the HDI, the Human Development Index, of course with its own imperfections, which combines income and health and education measures into a single indicator as a direct response to moving beyond GDP 1990 already, right? So this is something more than 30 years in the works. So we need to do more of this. Other indices like the unfortunately now, well, at least seemingly discontinued Global Competitiveness Index from the World Economic Forum has a bunch of wonderful measures that are useful in a development context. These can easily be replicated where data is available. And I've been happy to see natural capital measures and investment in that growing. On that note, of particular interest to me personally, as someone who grew up next to the Kruger National Park in South Africa, is the measurement and management of global public goods, specifically as it relates to animal and biodiversity conservation, and of course, combating climate change. Achieving both the sustainable and development parts of the SDGs are impossible if we do not take care of nature and our planet. However, developing the statistical capacity and resources to measure all the different types of natural capital accurately and regularly, as will be required for Target 17.19, is essential and will require global coordination and technical support to many GDP poor but resource-rich countries, linking to the green GDP concept Juliana already mentioned. If I have time, just to move on to the second question on the specific examples, I think we've already heard much, but adding to my opening remarks, I have a real interest in better quantifying and measuring global public goods such as carbon sinks, especially those in developing countries. The Congo Basin, the Amazon, the Southeastern Asian rainforest areas, protected wildlife areas across Africa immediately come to mind. Of course, getting this done, that will allow us to link to a lot of development of financial instruments such as nature bonds, which is a relatively new and interesting concept in the context of reforming the global financial architecture. This was actually the theme of this year's African Development Bank meetings in Nairobi that I was lucky to attend. So, it kind of builds on each other, right? If we can figure some things out and measure some things properly, which is, of course, crucial to getting this done, it would open up a lot of other avenues for supporting the SDGs, and I'll stop there.
Thank you. And now Florencia.
Thank you, Lynn. And as it happened with Henrik, many of the points that I will make maybe will echo some of the things that our colleagues have already said. But we're currently facing this polycrisis that at its core reveals this crisis in the sustainability of life itself. So we have a socioeconomic paradigm that has long operated on the assumption that people on the planet should serve the economy, when we all know that it should be the other way around. So as we were discussing before, GDP fails to account for many critical elements, and I would like to focus specifically on one, that is the invaluable contribution of unpaid care and domestic work. This work, primarily performed by families and within them by women, is the invisible pillar of our socioeconomic system, because unpaid care and domestic work is essential for creating the so-called human and social capitals, which ultimately drive economic growth. So we cannot even have markets if we do not have people, and we cannot have people living meaningful lives if we do not have this wide-ranging set of activities, relationships, and bonds that sustain life on a daily basis and support individuals in developing their capabilities and living life to their fullest. So despite this relevance, we know that we take unpaid work for granted, even in national accounts. And while GDP does partially account for some capability building services and activities, like, for example, education and healthcare, when they are provided through the private or public systems, it overlooks the crucial role of families in this endeavor. So the resources and the unpaid work invested by families in making these systems function and in humans effectively being able in developing their capabilities are largely overlooked. So to truly advance the SDGs, we need metrics that recognize and value these fundamental contributions to our society and the economy. To move into examples, to try to address these gaps, we have been developing the basic care basket, which is a synthetic indicator that aims to complement GDP and other measurements by estimating the cost of care production from the perspective of families and women. The basic care basket, or BCB, focuses on households with children up to 17 years old, calculating the monetary value of goods, services, and work needed to produce sufficient family care. And it evaluates the resources that families mobilize to provide care while achieving like two crucial outcomes simultaneously. On the one hand, thriving new generations as measured by children and adolescents being able to meet a given set of development, behavioral, and educational outcomes, and women's autonomy in terms of their time use and not having just the full responsibility of unpaid work within the household. Because up to now, satellite accounts have been a step forward, estimating the contribution of unpaid work in aggregate terms. We know that this value has been estimated at between 10 and 40% of GDP, depending on the country. What we are looking for with the BCB is to complement these previous measurements at the micro level by adopting the household perspective and estimating the cost of producing human capabilities, which ultimately also foster this economic growth and development in social and economic terms. So in this way, the BCB links unpaid household work with the monetized economy, treating also healthcare and education as investments in capability production. So we believe that these kind of metrics like the BCB could provide valuable information to try to recognize unpaid work and also better understand how could policies and investments better support families in caregiving.
Thank you. And now for the second round of comments. And so for our panelists, I'm going to go in reverse order. So Florencia and Henrik will be going to you first. The final question to consider is, what are specific capacity gaps and needs at the national and international levels to advance the efforts to move beyond GDP? Florencia.
We'll try to be brief so we have more time then for the discussion. But I think first, the major gap in terms thinking about unpaid work is conceptual. So we need to recognize unpaid work as a productive process, even if it's productive in a different way to the kind of production that we normally think of. Because although it's not monetized or wage, it produces immensely valuable outcomes, such as the development of human capabilities. As we were saying before, like markets cannot exist without humans, and humans cannot thrive and live meaningful lives without this unpaid work helping to support them throughout their lives, which becomes ever more important as we know that countries are experiencing the demographic transitions and their care needs are also changing. And the majority of this crucial work is conducted by families and especially by women without pay. So despite this value, we are not accounted for it, and we need to consider the value of this work in order to move beyond GDP. And the second significant gap is in terms of data collection and analysis. We know that many countries still lack satellite accounts to measure the estimated contribution of unpaid work. Many countries still lack time use surveys, which indicate how much time is devoted to unpaid work by families and women. In some cases, we also do not have enough data on household expenditures to understand how much families spend in money terms in services that also provide care through the market. So to truly move beyond GDP, we need better data to try to account for this contribution of care work and establish metrics to track progress. This is not only aligned to the last SDG, but also with SDG 5.4, which calls for recognizing and valuing unpaid care and domestic work through public services, infrastructure, social protection, and the promotion of shared responsibility within households. So addressing these gaps would allow us to develop more comprehensive and inclusive measures of progress and ultimately drive and support effective policies for sustainable development.
Thank you. Over to you, Henrik.
Thank you. Yes, so look, I completely agree with the points raised already by my colleagues today, but so I'm not going to repeat those. I'll then stick to the one that's my personal one, given my own background, and that is the measurement and use of natural capital, and really making the most of that. So I think a lot of it comes down to mainstreaming financial mechanisms and institutions to accommodate the valuation and use of it. So if we're talking about green bonds and anything in terms of financially reforming the global architecture to make use of this, we gotta do better at mainstreaming it. We gotta do better at measuring it, etc. So we need supporting regulatory environments to achieve this. Nature and where the major global public goods are and the financial capitals of the world are often quite removed from each other, right? So think the typical game ranger or conservationist versus a hotshot investment banker, right? It's two completely different worlds they operate in. So it takes a bit of convincing and repeating. The World Banks and the IMFs and the UN institutions of this world need to take the lead in emphasizing measures beyond GDP. They exist already. They need to do so in their flagship reports and continue to nudge individual countries, the statistical agencies, central banks, etc., to do the same. Look, most other normal economic variables that can supplement GDP already exist. It's there a case of just adequate resources to measure consistently in many countries. But in terms of natural capital, we need clear messaging, we need clear definitions. And really, it comes down to also a bit of better marketing to mainstream these natural capital concepts. Also thinking along the lines of a comment I saw already, like, why haven't we been able to move on from this? It's been an issue for 30-odd years. And so it's the messaging and the clarity of how it could be used, etc., that I think we could do better on.
Thank you. Juliana.
Thank you. I would rather just add a few points to what has already been shared. But again, I guess the main thing is for us to collaborate. There are different stakeholders who need to come into play to ensure that this is a success. So when we look at economic growth itself, we don't just need to have economists in the room. We need to have politicians even. Let's have environmentalists. Let's have people from the financial sector, even social workers come into play and share what they think should be done in order for us to develop these important metrics. Because at the end of the day, we're saying GDP is no longer just a number. We need to look at it as a comprehensive measure of wealth, of well-being, not just social well-being or financial well-being, but also economic well-being and all these aspects. So that's a key measure, which is cross-sector collaboration and also intergenerational collaboration. I'm so glad that we do have young people. I'm glad to represent young people on this platform and also share the insights from the youth, because youth voices also matter, and voices of women, voices of people from marginalized communities. Think of Africa, think of less developed countries. Those voices matter too as we think about how we can collaborate in ensuring that we move beyond GDP. So that's the first major point that I have. And the second point is the financial aspects. It has already been touched on, but I also think that when we talk about finances, let's think about the people in less developed countries, those economies. They probably are not prioritizing moving beyond GDP. It's probably not something that's on their table right now. So what can the more developed countries do, or what can the UN do, these international organizations do in order to support that? We need to provide the financial incentive even to ensure that these countries have the resources that they need to develop metrics that can measure well-being. We are talking about the care basket that was already mentioned. How can this look like in the context of Africa? What will this look like? What will it take for governments in these less developed countries to put this into play? So I think that's also a crucial measure that we think about. So just to conclude some of the statements I've mentioned already, individuals are important, the environment is important. Hence, we need to think of growth depending on people and the environment. If we're not acknowledging the value of people or the environment or the climate impact and all these issues, then we're really not doing much. So that marks the end of my presentation. Thank you.
And Anu.
Thank you very much. I really wanted to continue from Juliana's thoughts. We live on a shared and interconnected planet where no country should be left behind in the move beyond GDP. So I'd like to highlight some gaps we've identified in UNCTAD SDG Pulse publication, which provides insights on inclusive growth, productive capacities, digitalization, and the cost of SDG transitions. We find stark disparities in living conditions across countries affecting human well-being, like access to basic services, their affordability, and economic opportunities. Gender equality in trade is still lacking behind. with women producing only 20 to 40% of total export value, depending on the region. There's untapped potential, especially in promoting service sectors where women are more often employed. And in our Inclusive Growth Index, we find the biggest variation across countries in environmental sustainability. Even some high-income countries perform poorly on sustainability metrics. As countries reach higher income levels, access to green technologies will be crucial to avoid excessive waste and resource use in the future. Africa, in particular, currently lacks investment in green technologies based on our statistics. Many least developed countries rely on a few export products, and this with political instabilities and low institutional capacity, which was also previously mentioned, adds to countries' vulnerability to setbacks and global shocks. And it highlights the need to enhance governance capacities as part of the move beyond GDP. We should not forget the increasing digital and data divides that are exacerbated by the lack of digital governance while AI advances rapidly. There is great promise, but we need to develop sustainable digitalization strategies. As digital technologies heavily rely on natural resources, with ICT networks accounting for an estimated 6 to 12% of global electricity use, we risk tensions over critical minerals as well, related to the needs of the technological advances. All this calls for multilateral collaboration to ensure that countries facing instability, vulnerabilities, debt, and weak capacities can be part of the green transition. Global collaboration is critical to closing gaps in SDG achievement. Also by combating tax evasion and curbing illicit financial flows. And every year, when progress stalls, we will have higher annual cost for SDG achievement. So we need to act now. In his policy brief, and this is the final point, the UN Secretary General calls for a political commitment to move beyond GDP, develop metrics to value what counts, and enhance statistical systems to guide policy decisions. So let's look at the Summit of the Future and its pact and our governments to bring us to speed in September towards defining the metrics and the actions we will need. Going forward requires significant investment in data, in capacities of governance, a strong political will for innovative policies, and a commitment for valuing what truly counts. But it's not just a technical adjustment, it's a profound transformation in how we understand and pursue progress. And we need to come up with new language and framing for what we consider as success. And here, I would like to just repeat what Juliana said. We need to hear everyone's voices, including the young generation, as we are deciding today what will impact our futures. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a few minutes left, and we have many questions coming in on the chat. Livia, if you'd like to turn on your video as well, I'd like to raise one question in particular, kind of a group of questions that goes towards maybe the conclusion of this webinar, which is thinking about what is particular about this conversation at this time to think about beyond GDP. You know, what is going on in the world, I guess, so that we're almost at the Summit of the Future, where this issue has been raised and suggested to be on the agenda for heads of state. Is there something unique about this point in time when we might, you know, finally turn from talking about this to starting to use this? If I guess anyone wants to go first, please come off mute and comment about that.
Thank you. Maybe I just say two quick sentences. First of all, thank you for the panelists, and I think the reflections were really great. And I think we are indeed, and it was raised by many panelists, in this kind of peculiar situation, because on the one hand, GDP is a well-constructed index, on the other hand has those deficiencies. In the same time, we have known for the deficiencies for decades. And at the same time, we have pressing environmental and social issues. So it's extremely complex situation. But I think the summit of the future, and this is kind of the analogy with the SDGs, because even in SDG 1719, it started as moving beyond GDP, and then it turned into a little bit of a different issue. So my hope is that this issue will remain even in the priority of the summit of the future, and it won't get turned into something else, and it stays a priority. And then I think what also Anu and Juliana was saying, that we really need a political commitment and some guidance on which way to go, because if we would like to have something that complements GDP, that is equally robust or somewhat robust, applicable to the countries will start using it. We need something that those indices will be picked up and used, instead of having so many indicators out there and so many different indices that if every country chooses something different, we may again face a challenge. So I think the political commitment, the international guidance, the support, I'm hoping that will come with the summit of the future. And then probably some sort of a stage process, because our work shows that you can start going with the countries to move beyond GDP. There are a lot of lacking data, but there are also data available. So we just, I think, need to start moving, I would say, for real, to move beyond GDP and have something, and then we can improve that index or add to it or build on it. But so that if that process starts, I'm hoping that it will stick, and we will, in a couple of years, we can talk about what we learned about the moving beyond GDP process.
Maybe I can jump in to also address a little bit of this question. I think the moment is now a little bit related to what we were talking in terms of this unprecedented and simultaneous crisis that we are facing in terms of climate emergency, in terms of rising economic inequalities, in terms of democratic backsliding, and many other challenges that we are facing, in which we maybe lose the center of putting humans and people and their needs and the planet in the center of our actions, right? So we need to address these challenges urgently, especially as also the deadline of the SDGs is approaching. We are starting to think about the post-2030 agenda. So we have a goal to achieve, and we need to think what we're going to do after to meet these targets. And hopefully that's when this post-SDG and moving beyond GDP measurements can come to reality, including a little bit of all the different topics that we have been discussing. As also there's a growing awareness of the need to address this. As Livia was saying, we know that GDP is a valuable measure to measure a lot of stuff, but we have all these other aspects that are not being considered and that we need to address as soon as possible.
I can also jump in. So I just also want to highlight what Livia said in her presentation about how that if we do not move beyond GDP, we're stalling efforts towards eradicating global poverty. So I think it's also crucial that we look at what lies beyond GDP. Yes, we're focusing on economic success, but the end goal is for us to totally eradicate poverty itself that lies there. So I think it's crucial that governments and all the other stakeholders really prioritize the end goal, which is eradicating poverty, and look at how some of the steps that we have, like GDP, like the well-being aspect, like the Agenda 2063, like Africa's Agenda 2063, and all these issues come into play as we move towards the overarching goal, which is to eradicate poverty. So I do believe that it's time that we think of this aspect as a crucial matter, not just for moving beyond GDP, but also for the overarching goal, which is poverty itself. Let's eradicate poverty together.
Maybe I can add a very quick remark from my side. I think the Summit of the Future is mainly a gathering of the governments, but it's also a gathering with all stakeholders and a discussion that can really bring this initiative forward. And based on the consultations we have had so far, there's huge enthusiasm that finally these issues are being addressed. And this is a universal agenda. It's not intended to serve anybody's interest. It's intended to serve the future of the humankind and for us to find the right path for progress and development. And we look forward to major works from the academia. As Heinrich was saying, we need a common language. There's a lot of initiatives out there. We need to work jointly together across all disciplines to find a way to develop such a strong language as we have for the GDP and the system of national accounts that can be used by policymakers, academia, everybody, statisticians, so that we can inform actions in the same direction. So hopefully we can get something useful and concrete out of the process that is underway, and we hope for a high political engagement. Thank you.
No, thank you. And I guess, and Henrik, do you have any thoughts or?
I'll just say ditto. No, I think it's been well said. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Well, and I guess I was gonna, in closing, draw on something that you said already, that we need to nudge, repeat, mainstream. So it's not just SDG target 17.19, but it is incorporating ideas from throughout the SDG framework. And we need to keep that in mind and to remind people that it is one of the tools that we need in order to implement the full SDG agenda. And the idea that it's, it's conceptual. We need to recognize that it goes through measuring people, unpaid care work, the environment, that we're incorporating so many different things, and that there's so many kind of spin-offs and ways that I think, as Henrik said, that one action is going to build on the other, and think about that. And I think finally the idea of the clear messaging, and the involvement and the energy. So that going into the Summit of the Future, this is a big opportunity. It's on the global agenda. What can we do with it? And be sure that this, I guess we think of it as a complementary measure to GDP, but that it's a very important additional tool that we want our decision makers at all levels to have at their disposal to help them think about how to assess different policies, different things going on in their countries, in their communities, and how to make the SDGs a reality for all of us. So thank you so much for joining us for the last hour. And please keep in touch. The chat, as I said, has been very, very lively. Certainly there's a lot of energy on this. We look forward to continuing to engage on this issue.